So today we're going to cover all things glutes. Now the kind of main theme here is starting out these muscle groups typically is what do they do? So to answer the question of what is a muscle action, so for the glutes, it's going to be hip extension, external rotation. Okay, so hip extension, what exercises can we do that are going to be hip extension? Talk about length tension relationship. So short position where it's challenged in the most contracted position, mid-range where we're strongest, length and position. We're going to go through all three of those. Talk about some considerations for exercise selection, exercise execution, and get a fat ass. So for the more short position of the glute, where we're most challenged in this hip extended position, I'm going to prefer a 45-degree hip extension. I like a 45-degree hip extension. It's a little bit easier to execute than a hip thrust. So for the 45-degree hip extension, main things we're going to look at is keeping a stacked ribs over pelvis. The big issue with a hip thrust is a lot of people get into a lot of anterior pelvic tilt. So the weight sitting on our lap, it's actually going to pull us into anterior pelvic tilt. The issue with that is when we're training our glutes, we want to be in a neutral pelvis position. If we're in anterior pelvic tilt, we're actually disadvantaging the glutes. We're advantaging the hamstrings and adductors as our main hip extenders. So understanding we have three really main hip extenders: glutes, hamstrings, adductors. We want to make sure that we're doing glute things. We're trying to train our glutes, that they're in a good position to do glute stuff. Big keys for this, make sure that we're not overdoing hip extension. So I don't want to get from here all the way up to here. Right now I'm overextended the hip. I'm getting more from my erectors. I want to get pure hip extension, so I'm squeezing my glutes. When I get to this neutral position, that's when I'm done. So as far as execution here goes, we'll go toes slightly out. We want to get a weight where we can get full range of motion. So for me, my arms are long. If I have a kettlebell, I'm going to hit the ground. Usually holding a dumbbell or holding a preloaded straight bars to get the job done. That way we're also not capped out. A lot of people want to do just plates, like a 25-pound plate. That's going to be pretty light for more intermediate to advanced lifters. So something that's more loadable, stopping in our active range of motion. So again, I told you the reasons why I prefer this over a hip thrust. There's going to be an obvious cap of loading for this. So if we can master pelvic position under load, get a good idea of where our pelvis is in space, we have good control, and we want to load the more short position for some reason. If we want to do that, ensure we can start to work in like a machine hip thrust where you do have more external stability. It's easier to make sure that we don't hit technical failure before mechanical failure. So typically I'd opt for this for most people, but down the road, if you'd like to do that, that's something that's part of your goals, and sure, include that. So a big consideration when we're training our glutes, the main anatomical consideration is, do we bias internal rotation or external rotation? So if we're stuck in internal rotation, you can get external rotation of the hip. So if we kind of bias this short position right here, it's going to be hard to get our glutes to contract. On the other side of that, if we bias external rotation and we're here, it's going to be hard to get internal rotation to get length of that muscle. So we need to be able to get length, and we need to be able to contract the muscle to put tension through it. So if we're kind of stuck here, let's do some prep drills to get into ER. And if we're kind of stuck here, let's make sure our setup, execution, and our prep drills are going to get us ready to get into a good internally rotated position, so that way we can get a full contraction of the muscle, good tension to the muscle. More length and glute. Favorite way to do this is any more unilateral, so single leg variation. When it comes to finding the length and position of a muscle, kind of want to reverse engineer what the action of the muscle is. So for the glutes, extend the hip, external rotation. Length and position is going to be somewhere probably in hip flexion, internal rotation. So set up here, I'm going to go straight toe, straight foot position. I'm going to try and minimize dorsiflexion, so knee travel over toes. I want to keep that to a minimum. I want to get mainly hip flexion. Again, toes staying straight. I want to get to that point where I want to feel my knees starting to drive out. So I don't want to get into external rotation out here. I want to stay in that internally rotated position, get full length there. That's going to be our active range of motion. Ignore my awkward setup on this machine. Give you some options for the short position, 45-degree hip extension. You can rig up a GHR and then hip thrust. For this leg press, this is a pretty unique hip press. You're not going to find it in a lot of gyms. So any sort of hip press, any sort of leg press, where you can set that up, you can do the exact same thing. If you're limited, then you can do a more glute focus lengthen split squat or B stance RDL. I'll probably cover that in another video. Mid-range glutes, training the glutes in hip flexion, or sorry, in hip extension where we're strongest. Generally gonna wanna hinge, so that could be a like a trap bar RDL or a trap bar deadlift, or it could be a conventional RDL. I typically like an RDL. So here, I'm doing it in the hip thrust rack like a dipshit because all the other racks are taken right now. Big considerations here, neutral pelvis, right? I don't wanna be having my ass to the sky. I want my glutes tucked underneath, neutral. I want them in a strong position to actually extend the hip. The other thing, biggest mistake with RDLs, people will set up, see my feet, my toes are pointed who the fuck knows where, and they're super wide. So as I hinge back, look at my knees coming out. One, my knees are coming out. I can't internally rotate my hips. So I'm gonna be more hip width. I wanna have my toes more straight. Be able to get my weight into my midfoot so that I can get my knees pushing more forward. Now I'm internally rotated. I'm getting length in my glutes. I'm getting into a position to extend the hip. What that looks like from the side, if I'm too wide also, typically I'm gonna be rocking back like this. Right, that looks like shit. Usually it's not that bad. That's me over exaggerating that. But even when I get to this better position, I don't wanna see my knees rocking back, right? I pay attention to my hamstrings, to my glutes. If my knees are moving back with my hips, I'm not adding any tension to my hamstrings for one. Mainly, see my toes come up too. As my toes come up, I'm in weight position. So kind of killing two birds with one stone. Midfoot, locking in tension on our hamstrings. Also, more importantly, we're staying in a strong position so that we can produce the most force with our glutes and with our hamstrings. All right, so I almost missed this talking about glutes, sumo stuff. I don't know where this kind of originated, that sumo is like all that for glutes, but sumo, when we get into a sumo stance, so when I go super wide and externally rotated, what I'm doing in this position is I'm actually already shortening my glutes. And then as I kind of dip into this, I'm not getting much length to it. I'm pre-shortening my glutes. I'm actually getting in the weak position to actually not be able to move very much weight. So I'm not gonna be putting effective tension to my glutes. So what I would wanna do instead is, instead of a sumo, I'd wanna get into like more of a regular hinge variation. So if I'm more hip width, toe straight, I can now lengthen my glutes. I can get more effective tension in them. So sumo is actually gonna really disadvantage our glutes. I would stray away from sumo in most cases because we're going to be actually loading our quads and adductors more through hip extension. Finishing up glutes, yeah, I changed outfits. I fucked up and I forgot to record the outro to this. But glutes, load hip extension, right? So if we want to do short, mid, long, some sort of isolated hip extension, I like the 45-degree hip extension, less limitations than a barbell hip thrust or then like a hip thrust variation. 2, do a hinge, something hingy, dumbbell RDL, barbell RDL, load it, get strong there, do it correctly. 3, we can lengthen our glutes. So do some sort of leg press variation or like B stance RDL variation where we can actually kind of wrap the glutes around the hip, get full length to it. Other than that, don't overcomplicate it. We don't need as much variety as the fitness world might make you think. Keep it simple, you get at the basics, send it.